This episode, I'm joined by Emily Herring to discuss her new book, Herald of a Restless World, How Henri Bergson Brought Philosophy to the People. I'd like to say a big thank you to all my paying patrons and subscribers making all this work possible. And if you'd like to support the podcast and keep everything running, please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy.
So, Emily Herring, thanks very much for joining me on Hermitix podcast.
Hi.
We are going to be discussing your soon-to-be-released book, Herald of a Restless World, How Henri Bergson Brought Philosophy to the People. And this is being published by Basic Books, and it is being released. There will be links for both versions in the description below, but it's being released in the US on October 22nd and the UK on October 24th. And this chat will probably be released maybe a week before or right before. So the book, go pre-order it right now. This is a biography of Henri Bergson, continental philosopher of time, of, in a way, mathematics. But the biography itself has for quite a while, in a way, for those in the know, is a known biography. There is all these anecdotes about Bergson and his interesting life and his celebrity and his run-ins with people like Russell and the famous Einstein debate. And sort of, if you study philosophy, you will know these things. But as I understand it, up until now, there hasn't been an English biography. So this is the first English biography of Bergson. And it's a great read. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and it's a good introduction to his philosophy as well. So, Emily, please tell us a little bit about yourself, what it is you do, and the genesis of this biography.
Hi, so thank you so much for having me. Well, I first came across Bergson as a high school student because I did most of my studies in France. And so everyone studies philosophy in France in high school. So that we're quite lucky in that way. And I remember being really intrigued by this character and by his ideas about language at the time was what they told us about. The idea that I remember the phrase, words are mere labels, we affix to things. I remember thinking that was very cool when I was 17. But then later I learned a bit more about his philosophy. And again, even though it was, a century after he wrote his main books, I thought it was all very new and exciting. And I ended up writing a PhD thesis in the history of biology, actually, about Bergson's reception among 20th century biologists, because he wrote a book called Creative Evolution that dealt with evolution and had a very wide appeal. And so it was that time that I started learning more about his life, which, as well as his philosophy, is extremely fascinating, full of celebrity cameos, and that kind of quite naturally led into, as you said, there's nothing much in the English-speaking world about his life. There are some very good studies of his philosophy that came out in the last 10 years, say. There's been a kind of maybe revival of his ideas. But his life story in itself is fascinating as well. So that's how the book came about, really. I've spent the past over decade of my life really obsessing over this man, this philosopher. And I'm no longer in academia. I'm a freelance writer and editor now. But I've spent a lot of time, these past few years just writing this book.
So it was an immediate obsession from when you were 17?
I think...
Slow burn? And then
slow burn.
I'm in.
Yeah, I think in university, in undergrad, there was something very appealing about, and I think that's what perhaps drew a lot of people to him in his time as well, about the language he uses, the very beautiful metaphorical language he uses that actually won him a Nobel Prize for literature. I think I was drawn in by that, and also perhaps I didn't struggle with Bergson as much as I did with some of the German philosophers, maybe, I was studying at the time as well. And as I said, I think I felt like I was encountering something new, fresh, really interesting that I hadn't come across before.
Okay. So, like, aside from one thing that always interests me with biographies, aside from sort of events and his philosophy, you've obviously spent a lot of time with the man now. Do you have because from portraits, like visual portraits, and from snippets, one might get the impression that he's quite austere, or maybe even a little bit peculiar because of his hat and this sort of semi-gaunt image. But this isn't really the case. So after spending so much time with him, what if you were to step into a room with Bergson, what is he like?
That's a really good question. I get the sense, from photos of him, he gives, as you say, he gives the impression that he's this quite strict figure, and it's quite hard to imagine how he became this kind of rock star of philosophy of the early 20th century. My impression from going through what remains of his correspondence is that there's a bit of a paradox to him, or a duality, where on the one hand he was this quite austere, quiet, private person who absolutely hated noise, who actually couldn't really stand the empty chatter of social gatherings, and who much preferred one-on-one, deep philosophical conversations. But on the other hand, he was highly ambitious, and he really wanted to make his mentors proud and climb the institutional ladder of French academia. And he was actually very good at socializing and networking and building and maintaining relationships with the right people. So these two aspects, I think, were in constant tension, because obviously for someone who hated noise, he became literally a superstar, one of the most famous and recognizable people in the world around 1910. So I find that very interesting. I also don't think he's quite as austere as he looks in photographs. So people who knew him well describe him as, yes, perhaps he was quiet, but he was actually quite funny, or at least he had a good sense of humor. There are a few elements that I think give a good idea of the kind of person he was. One thing is that I noticed that even when he became extremely famous, he really did his best to be generous and respectful in his correspondence, whether it was someone important writing to him or not. And he was very generous with his advice to sort of early career people, or nobody people who would come to him and send him their articles. And so obviously there were times when he couldn't respond at all because he was so overwhelmed with correspondence, but the times he did, I think that says something about someone, the way that, so he wasn't this complete careerist. He was generous with his philosophical insights and with his time. But also he was very worried about what people would think about him, in the sense that he was quite afraid of giving the impression that he wasn't giving enough time to people. So there was a point when he was so overwhelmed that he decided he would stop doing any social obligation, because he didn't want one of the countesses that he knew to be upset that he refused one of her invitations and accepted another one. So he did have this kind of he was well aware of being under public scrutiny all the time, and he when his friends wrote, or people he knew wrote about him, he would often supervise and kind of ask them to delete personal information about him, or things that he worried might be misinterpreted. So he was a bit of a control freak in that aspect, but I think it was very much because he was afraid of adding more noise perhaps to his life, his already very noisy life. And then two other things that I think are quite interesting character-wise. One is that the way he put it, he didn't want to speak on things that he felt he didn't have time to properly meditate and think about. So often in interviews, he'd be asked questions about all sorts of things, political issues, current issues, and he would often dodge the question or try not to respond, claiming that he didn't know enough about it. He hadn't had time to think about it. And this included a lot of sort of the attacks that he was subjected to by the anti-Semitic far right in France, who kind of relentless. He never addressed these publicly, and so someone like Charles Péguy, who the writer who was close to Bergson, saw this as a bit cowardly. And it might be true that Bergson was afraid of backlash that would come from this, but I think it's the tension between these two aspects of him that I was talking about. He both never stopped seeking out the fame that, or at least the progression in his career that came with the fame or brought about the fame. At the same time, he was really trying to mitigate the sound around him and the noise and all the complications. And the last thing, the last sort of story that I think says quite a lot, is that Bergson died in 1941, so he was in occupied Paris, Nazi-occupied Paris, and because of his stature, the Vichy collaborationist Vichy government had offered kind of exemption from the anti-Semitic laws that had been put in place, and Bergson actually refused the special treatment, and ended up basically, from various testimony, the story goes that he died contracting pneumonia from waiting in line to register as a Jew in the sort of really cold, a cold winter day in Paris in January of 1941. I think that says something interesting about him as well. So that was a lot. Yeah. I don't know how clear all of that was, but that's the image I have in my mind. Someone who's conflicted, someone who's exhausted a lot of the time, and perhaps someone who sees fame as a means to an end, or who sees it as a necessary, unwelcome, perhaps, consequence of doing what he is called to do, which is philosophy.
Yeah. So one of the more, just on this notion of fame and a lot of noise, one of the more sort of humorous parts of your book is early on, and forgive me because I forget the names of the lecturer and the place, but Bergson was booked to be obviously after this lecturer, who was before that point sort of like 6 people would be in his lectures, very unpopular, very dry, very boring, and then all of a sudden, slowly over the course of a few weeks, he's noticing that more and more people are coming to his lectures, and then the lecture halls are literally full, and then there's like crowds, and then rows and rows of people, and eventually with Bergson's lectures themselves, there's people like leaning in the windows, up to 300 to 700 people, whatever it might be. This is how popular he is. And so I guess my question there is, like, as he's in the sense that Warhol is, I guess, for art, Bergson is his philosophy, is the first celebrity, is philosophy's first Zizek. Doesn't make any sense. Did he ever comment on sort of, I guess, just like that? You mentioned it a little bit, but because it's such a key aspect of his life, I guess, of being a celebrity, did he ever comment on what? I guess the important thing is what he saw as the future of philosophy in relation to that sort of popularity.
Yeah, I'm not sure actually if he thought about it in those terms. It's almost as though what happened to him was kind of exceptional in his mind, but he hated it really. It was cause of a lot of stress. So it was the cause of complicated relationships with his colleagues, as you just mentioned. So it was Leroy Beaulieu, who was a political philosopher, economist, and quite dry. Apparently, his lectures were extremely boring. But rich women would send their valets to sit in on that lecture so that they would have a seat saved for Bergson's, that kind of thing. So that was difficult for Bergson because obviously that would create tension within amongst his colleagues at the Collège de France. But also he worried about it meant that other philosophers would take him less seriously, and to a certain extent that was the case. And obviously it was just it was really deranged. I mean, there are stories of people trying to steal locks of his hair from his barber, which I find hard to believe because he didn't have that much hair. But perhaps there was some locks to be had. I don't know, and that people would sort of had hunted down his holiday home, and so it's a level of fame that perhaps not many people had experienced to that degree at that time, or at least not many philosophers, that's for sure. As for I can't really recall him ever talking about it in relation to sort of the future of philosophy. I don't think he saw it as something that might. I think the whole thing confused him, to be honest, and he kind of it was something he lived with, but
it does seem confusing. I mean, I think of rock stars, I think of like the Beatles, where there's that recording where everyone's screaming so much you can't hear it, their fame or whatever it might be. And I've heard of rock stars, people grabbing their hair and trying to get locks of their hair. But I guess that seems more appropriate because it's like a pure, I don't know, well, a rock star vibe. That doesn't really seem like it would be a thing for philosophy, which is a quiet pursuit where you have to listen to a relatively complicated, or maybe not complicated, but at least complex ideas. And so I guess maybe it's a silly question, and I don't want to sort of downplay that it might just be the case that his philosophy really was that intriguing and outstanding. Why was he so famous? Is there any other reasons, or was it just like...
It's a difficult question. Why is it that this man caused the first ever traffic jam on Broadway? That's the story that always comes back. The lecture he gave in New York in 1913. So imagine the cars at that time clogging up Broadway. It is a legitimate question and a difficult one that quite a few scholars have tried to solve. Is it simply because he was so original? That seems like it probably isn't enough to explain it. In a sense, yes, because, well, in a sense he was very original. There's a sense in which his philosophy literally kind of flipped millennia of Western philosophy on its head, sort of going against this obsession with permanence and eternity. But I don't think that's quite enough to explain why crowds of people who were not philosophers, who were not students of philosophy, were talking about him, were trying to get in. There's another way of looking at it, that he was kind of a symptom of the intellectual climate of the time, that his philosophy in a sense was timely, that at the end of the 19th century, with sort of all the newly industrialized cities and advances made in science, there was what was later called the disenchantment, what Weber later called the disenchantment of the universe. This idea that there was the world was being stripped of wonder and mystery, and that this philosopher who was speaking in terms of creativity, and who was criticizing the rigid symbolism of science, was an antidote to this disenchantment. Again, that's probably not enough to explain it, but it does. It is one explanation, and it's one that was costly to Bergson as well, because his ideas were caricatured, simplified in ways that then he didn't like and was kind of upset about. And we might talk about Bertrand Russell later. That would be one good example. But I think there's also just there was something about him, again, not apparent in the photos, but he was an extremely talented speaker. From all the testimony that I've read from people who attended his lectures, that they all describe it as a kind of magical, entrancing experience, that he there was a melodic quality to his voice, and that he was able to bring together all these complex ideas and weave them together in perfect harmony. And so perhaps it's a mixture of all these things. It's a kind of he was quite original, but that's not enough to explain the fame. His ideas just sort of came at a time when there was a need for them, I think. And he was a very good voice. And also he was speaking at the Collège de France every week, which is a place that is open to the public and has always been ever since it was put in place. It's public lectures. Anyone can attend. There's no enrollment. So that must have helped as well, although there are lots of other Collège de France professors who didn't become international celebrities. But I think that definitely had that, in addition to everything else I just mentioned, probably helped. And the last thing maybe, and the thing that Bergson himself actually, he attributed his success to his lecturing style, in the sense that he believed that a philosopher should use everyday language to express his or her ideas. And so perhaps he was deceptively simple or easy to understand. That's my take on it, but it's also just one of those things that kind of, there's a perfect convergence of a lot of factors, it seems to me.
I was going to say, I mean, it seems that the low hanging fruit might be post World War One misery and confusion and distress. When you've got this, am I right in thinking the bulk of his philosophy would have been post World War One?
So no, it's actually his real fame moment. The peak of his fame was 1910. Oh. In the UK, especially. That's when he really exploded. 1910, 1911, and there's actually a sense in which post World War One, a lot of the versions of hope and creativity and that existed before had kind of disappeared, and that kind of explains how he so quickly actually sort of disappeared, or at least that's one of the explanations. Yeah. So yeah, it's very much sort of late Belle Epoque, culmination of the Belle Epoque, or the end of the Belle Epoque at least, years leading up to World War One, where he was really the most famous.
Well, another thing I was going to add in there, and I mean, I guess this probably would have come up later, but maybe the first renaissance of Bergson was because of the Gilles Deleuze's Bergsonism. And from everything you've said so far, I'm suddenly realizing that between the two, there is a mass of connections. That Deleuze loved to just sit on his own. He said philosophy was done correctly when you just sat on your own with a pen and paper without all the crowds. But Deleuze himself became extremely popular. And then one reason for his popularity that's popularly accepted is because it's very hopeful and optimistic. And so, optimism seems to be, I guess, the easiest reason to say why this man was so popular. But that seems, I don't know, as you said, maybe it's the easiest thing to do would be to say, look, these things just happen, and there was a lot of converging factors.
That's what I think. And I sometimes also think that perhaps the reason, I mean, obviously it's not to the scale it was in the early 20th century, but one of the reasons that we're returning to him a bit now, or at least there seems to be in the English-speaking world, a revival, is perhaps that some of the anxieties of the people in the early 20th century maybe mirror some of our own. This idea of, so at the time it was all of these versions of quantification or scientism sort of taking hold in areas that were once free of it. So things like the mind and free will. And I feel like perhaps now there are similar anxieties about the way algorithms and AI, and I don't know. I mean, I don't know enough about these things to really say, but I wonder if there are anxieties that are similar in nature, and it's a kind of swing of the pendulum thing where there's kind of a return to a need for enchantment again.
Okay, return to Bergson. One thing on the popularity, that I feel we should add in is Bergson as a philosopher for women,
Yes.
and his his distinct popularity with female fans and followers and listeners. So, is there any distinct reasons for this?
Again, it's
Was
a
he
difficult.
just that charming?
Well, I don't know about that. I don't know about the again, it's difficult to pinpoint exactly how any kind of trend starts or the why of it, but certainly there was a really broad appeal amongst women. So a lot of women attended his lectures in Paris, but it was also true outside of France. There was this huge enthusiasm to the point that it was actually used against Bergson. His critics used the fact that women enjoyed his philosophy to argue that it wasn't very good philosophy. And in turn, it was then used against the women as well. The fact that they would like a philosopher of intuition. So all of these caricatures of Bergson, which are not really true, but this idea that he was this anti-rationalist thinker, that in turn was used against women to say, well, they maybe we should give them the vote. That was an actual debate that happened in French Parliament. If all these women who are reading Bergson, maybe they're not rational enough to vote, kind of thing. So it kind of went both ways. As to why women enjoyed Bergson, some of the reasons I cited before, maybe this notion of hope at a time when there were all these movements for the right to vote, for things like this, at a time when it was still quite difficult for women to access universities in the very early 20th century. Women weren't really at the Sorbonne, but they could go to the Collège de France and listen to his lectures that were in a language that didn't presuppose prior philosophical knowledge. I think a lot of these things definitely helped. Was he that charming? Perhaps, I don't know. Again, the philosopher.
But he wasn't like, Guattari. He wasn't a womanizer or anything.
Not at all. No, not at all. Again, photos will not suggest that it was necessarily for his looks. But there might have been something about him that appealed to the women of the time that we can't quite see from a photograph. But I just do find it fascinating because especially the nature of sort of the misogynistic attacks that were actually coupled with anti-Semitic attacks by the anti-Semitic far right. So Action Française was one of those nationalistic anti-Semitic groups in France that attacked Bergson, and their ideological leader was Charles Maurras, and his ideal vision for France was the rational country of Descartes, and a kind of masculine imperative. And Bergson represented, not only was he de facto, he couldn't be French because he was Jewish, that was their idea, so they called him a barbarian, but also he was feminine. His philosophy was feminine because they said anti-rational, and because the proof being so many women flocked to his lectures. So that's one really, terrible but fascinating side product of the Bergson story and of fame.
So thus far, Bergson's biography that has become the popular biography basically seems like a series of either things that he had absolutely no control over whether or not they happened, or just complete misconceptions. So everything, because there is this, and this is me making a very clumsy segue, but there is misconceptions around Bergson, which I think we spoke about this before we started recording, so I will say I clarified with you that this is right. But misconceptions regarding Bergson and the infamous Einstein-Bergson debate that not only are incorrect, but are incorrect in a way that has solidified itself as a myth, which has become like the foundation of philosophy going forward. So like for me, if people say, where does the analytic continental divide come from, even though when you look into it, the divide may be not even to do with style or temperament or even philosophy, the beginning seems to be not the debate between Einstein and Bergson itself, but the popular misconception of the idea that Bergson lost this debate, and the whole thing is just very messy.
Yeah, very messy. And actually, Jimena Canales makes a very similar point in her book, which is about the debate and the sort of aftermath, the before and the aftermath, called The Physicist and the Philosopher. But yeah, it was a very messy affair, and it was yet another example of Bergson being represented as both scientifically illiterate, which he was not, and anti-science, which he was not at all. And I can go into detail on that if you want. But on the debate and the aftermath, what happened? So the way it happened even was a bit of a nightmare for Bergson, because so Einstein had come to Paris. Bergson obviously had been taking interest in Einstein at that point because of relativity, because it dealt with time, and he saw it as his duty to analyze relativity in the light, or using durée, or in relation at least with durée. But he had no intention to publicly debate Einstein. That was not part of the plan. And Einstein, who came to Paris, was not invited by the Physics Society because of sort of lingering anti-German sentiments, possibly also anti-Semitism, I don't know. He was invited by the French Philosophical Society, and Bergson was in the audience, and Einstein was just asked all these very difficult questions about the relation of relativity to Kant, and he was dodging a lot of the questions, and I can't really blame him. It was all these French philosophers really laying it thick, and so kind of the person chairing was in despair almost, kind of dragged Bergson into the discussion, hoping to sort of give this whole debate, or the whole event, a bit more substance. And Bergson was very reluctant, but then did launch into this 30-minute sort of improvised expose, to which Einstein famously sort of had this great one-liner where he just said that the time of the philosopher does not exist, thus sealing Bergson's fate as the loser. But actually, a lot of central to Bergson's argument really was that he had no objection to Einstein's definition of simultaneity or to the theory of relativity. And his main point was that once relativity was accepted as a physical theory, the philosopher still had room to speak. And yeah, Einstein's French was adequate but not excellent. He may have missed some of the subtleties of Bergson's very long comment, rather than a question, kind of intervention. And his response was much more memorable. And at that point, Bergson was a lot more famous than Einstein, but that quickly changed kind of after that point. But Bergson was very disappointed. He felt that he was not understood as a philosopher, that he felt that Einstein did not have the philosophical tools to really understand what Bergson was trying to do, while Bergson had engaged extremely seriously with Einstein's work. He obviously... there were some misunderstandings in his readings, as much as there were for anyone reading it at the time. But Bergson was actually very mathematically and scientifically literate and proficient. And it seems like they both talked past each other, and that Bergson ultimately sort of retracted from the debate because it was at a point in his life where he was exhausted and fed up.
So what year was this?
So this was 1922.
Okay.
So this was at a point where it was over a decade of non-stop noise for Bergson, and this was just adding more noise. And yeah, he was just trying to say that Einstein's theory rested upon a set of unconscious and somewhat unsophisticated metaphysical foundations that needed to be questioned. But obviously he was shut down. And I actually wrote down this quite good quote about why Bergson hated public debates. He told one of his friends, no good can ever come from public debates because no one will ever accept to admit publicly to a mistake. And in a dispute, you force your opponent to objectify thoughts that would otherwise have remained unconscious or at least inconsistent. And that's an additional obstacle you raise. So he was really not looking for a public debate. He would have much rather maybe correspond with Einstein, which they did to a certain extent, but nothing fruitful really came out of that. But so I think you're right. There was this sense in which that debate, and it kind of launched some satellite debates, and there was a lot of press around it. It kind of cemented this idea that scientific truth or what science has to say has more value than all other forms of knowledge and discourse combined, which is something Canales shows in her book quite well. And I think that kind of parallel to this, sort of analytic continental divide cemented here.
Yeah, I mean, ironically, it seems to philosophically cement that only one philosophical, like metaphysical worldview, which is basically scientific materialism, is correct. And nowadays we have people such as, Neil deGrasse Tyson, I think it is, famously, ceaselessly commenting about how philosophers are sort of useless to science, even though the history of philosophy really is scientists. We mentioned Descartes, and who was scientist and philosopher, and many others along this line. So this is maybe a good place to bring in Bertrand Russell, who, thinking of it now, sorry, Bertie, but I actually think this is the only time after about 270 episodes now that he's actually been mentioned. And Bergson has been mentioned many times. So, Russell, there you go.
Well, I'm very pleased about that.
My apologies. But Russell, am I getting things in the right order, that this, let's just say, general atmosphere and temperament that rises from this event, Russell seems to take this and transform it into his appreciation of Bergson, but Russell is also basically, like, I guess we could say, the first pop philosopher as well. So this gets it. Is there a section in Russell's history of Western philosophy on Bergson? Yeah,
there is. Yeah, and actually, well, no, it's not. Well, I don't know. I'm very biased, but he does get a lot wrong about Bergson, and that's not just me being biased. It's very thoroughly unfair reading of Bergson. That some of the backstory, which is a bit of gossip, but also historical gossip, but also kind of helps situate how Russell first encountered Bergson. So the first thing he ever held against Bergson was being more famous, Bergson being more famous than him, in a sense, because Russell was extremely ambitious as a young philosopher. He was younger than Bergson, and the first time he encountered Bergson was because Russell was set to deliver a presidential address for the Aristotelian Society, and that coincided with Bergson's first visit to Britain at a time when he was absolutely his popularity was soaring. And so Russell was asked to move the date of his presidential address, and this infuriated him. And he complained to his mistress about it a lot in his correspondence with her. And then the presidential address happened. Bergson was in the audience. We don't have any record of what actually went down, but from Bergson's account years later, in a letter to one of his friends, he believed that he had sort of humiliated Russell, or at least refuted him, thus humiliating him, making him even more furious. And And Bergson believed that Russell had never forgiven him for this. So this was between 1910 and 1912, all of this was happening. So 10 years before the Einstein thing even happened. But it does seem like Russell left that meeting furious, and that he then made taking down Bergson his main priority. In 1912, he published an article called, I think, The Philosophy of Bergson, which actually is reproduced 30 years later in his History of Western Philosophy. He adds an introduction, but otherwise it's word for word the same article, in which he basically paints Bergson as completely mathematically illiterate, which again is not true. Bergson was actually something of a math genius, or at least he was very talented at mathematics. When he was a teenager, he solved a problem that the 17th century polymath Blaise Pascal had left unanswered. Bergson just casually solved it. His maths teacher at the time was amazed and published the results. And again, Bergson took science very seriously. He engaged with the major scientific works of his time in every single one of his books, from experimental psychology to neurophysiology to evolutionary biology, paleontology. All of these, he read more scientific literature than he did philosophy almost. So Russell had this preconception of Bergson as someone who talks about intuition. Intuition for Russell is not something that is acceptable as an idea. He misunderstood what Bergson meant by intuition, but the two couldn't be more different, really. In the set, so it's kind of understandable how Russell would have had some hostility, I guess, because Russell has this view that ordinary language is unsuited because it's ambiguous or misleading, and so it's the philosopher's job to build the sort of logical language that will express the reality that physics expresses. Whereas Bergson was sort of on the opposite side of the spectrum. He thought that language, he didn't believe that language left too much room for interpretation. He believed it was too restrictive, everyday language even. He believed that language didn't need to become more abstract, but more precise. And by precise, he meant fluid enough to adopt the contours of the exact reality that it is describing at that moment. So you can see how obviously the two would not necessarily get along, but Russell took it to a whole other level. There was this kind of vindictiveness about the way he dealt with Bergson, even after Bergson's death. When he published his History of Western Philosophy, he was at that point claiming that I don't have the quote in mind, but it's something about how his philosophy basically saved the world from, or rendered antiquated. It was something like that. The mysticism of thinkers like Bergson. Bergson was critical of certain aspects of scientific symbolism and language, but at no point does he reject science through and through. At no point does he say science shouldn't be doing what it's doing. He viewed science and metaphysics as two different but complementary forms of knowledge, and that's something that Russell never acknowledges, or perhaps sees in his reading of Bergson.
At this point, I just think poor Bergson. I mean, was anyone critical of him or tackle his work, on its own terms? It all seems very much like just a misunderstanding, or in Russell's case, vindictive because he wanted to be famous.
Well, there were serious readings of his work in French philosophy, but but those weren't the ones that were the noisiest. Those were not the ones that were picked up the most. And most of what was published about him, by 1910, most of what was published about Bergson there were popularizations of his ideas for the general public, which often were distortions. And then there were press articles that focused more on the chaos that came with his lectures than the actual ideas. Or his ideas were reduced to catchphrases. So it was élan vital, intuition, durée, all of these words without much context. But obviously, well, not obviously, but there were serious readers of Bergson at the time. There were many, actually. But yeah, as I said, not the ones that attracted the most attention, sadly.
Okay. Speaking of his philosophy, I mean, are there any places, I guess, in his biography? I mean, you mentioned élan vital, and time is another concept, or creativity, or intuition. Are there any places within his biography where you see, I mean, it's a bit of a lazy question from my side, but where you see clear connections between his biographical life and interests and his philosophy?
It's a difficult question because I almost tried avoiding writing what we would call an intellectual biography, in the sense that I didn't want to, or at least not too obviously, or at least not too consciously, trace these kind of links, just because it was something that he cautioned against, the kind of retroactive mapping of a thought based on events, which he thought would always be quite artificial and wouldn't say very much. I think the most biographical, or the most sort of clear link between the biography and the thought is his sort of big switch. He went from defining himself as a mechanist and a materialist when he was 17, 18, to a few years later, in his early 20s, he'd come up with durée and a completely different worldview and philosophy. So I feel like that probably had to do with circumstance a lot, because it happened at a time when he had just left the École Normale Supérieure, where I get the sense that debates were quite rigid, and there were sort of a few ways of looking at things, and they were pitted against each other in sort of almost caricatural ways. And then suddenly he was out of Paris and teaching in provincial towns and meeting all sorts of people and reading lots of different things, including psychology, which before that he had no interest in, and encountering weird gatherings where people did hypnosis and things like this. And I think it kind of opened his mind to a lot of different ways of looking at things. So he went from being a big fan of Herbert Spencer, essentially, and he said he dreamed of extending his mechanistic explanation even more, and being an even better version of Spencer, to part of that project, that was his initial sort of PhD doctoral thesis project, was Spencer plus, basically. And then the way he tells it, he was looking at different ways, different concepts of mechanics and physics of the time, to sort of lay the groundwork of what was going to be his big synthetic theory. And it was when he was looking at time, the letter T in the equations of mechanics, that he realized, he had this big eureka moment, or this big realization, that, and a big change of heart, but this realization that time as it is expressed in science doesn't contain any temporality to it. Another way he talks about this eureka moment is one day he was explaining one of Zeno's paradoxes to his students, high school students, It's the paradox where there's a race between Achilles and a tortoise, and the tortoise has a head start. And long story short, Achilles never catches up because before catching up, he has to go halfway to where the tortoise is, and before getting there, a quarter of the way, and before getting there, an eighth of the way, etc., to infinity. And you could even say that he never gets across the finish line. And so Bergson was explaining this to his students, this Zeno who claimed to have shown that movement was impossible, motion was impossible, and Bergson realized that he hadn't proved that motion was impossible, but that when you represent motion geometrically, you come across all kinds of problems, like this paradox, this kind of seemingly impossible to solve paradox. All Zeno had been able to show was that movement could be represented as a line, and that line could be divided, but he hadn't said anything about motion. And similar for Bergson, it was similar with time, the way it was treated in astronomy, astronomy, for instance, or in any physical theory. All what he called the durée had been taken out of time. So I can keep going.
Sure.
I've got.
Maybe we could begin with a definition of durée,
which is very difficult because. You kind of have to start with what durée is not to be able to get to what he meant by durée, and because it's something that kind of resists definition, because it resists sort of categorization, or it resists the mechanics of language itself, which sounds like a great excuse to not define something, but I'll try and get there. So basically, Bergson's idea of durée, as I was saying, stems from this realization that time as it is represented in scientific equations, as well as in everyday language, contains no temporality at all. And this is because in order to talk about things that are in constant flux, it's much easier to freeze them, to be able to then measure them, or to categorize them into easily delimited units that are then juxtaposed. And so we position moments in time or bits of motion, like Zeno's, like Achilles' steps. We divide them, we position them next to one another like objects in space. We spatialize time. We treat moments in time as objects in space, but this is not, according to Bergson, how time is experienced or how time works, how durée works. So there's I think it's in his first book, I think it's in Time and Free Will, there's a thought experiment that's quite useful to understand what he means, where he says that imagine that there is some kind of evil genie, not Descartes' evil genie, but a sort of temporal evil genie, that through some magic spell makes it so that the Earth no longer rotates on its axis in 24 hours, but in 12 hours. And imagine that every other phenomenon accelerates proportionally. This would make no difference to the elaborate equations of the astrophysicist. The mathematical relations would be preserved. This major shift in tempo would make no difference. But for the astrophysicists themselves, or anyone experiencing this shift, there would be a huge change. We would realize that we've not stored up the same amount of time, that maybe we wouldn't measure it as a quantitative difference, but we would certainly experience a shortening, or we would experience something, a change in the progress between sunrise and sunset. Mm-hmm. And it's exactly this qualitative change, this change in our lived experience, that cumulative aspect of the passing of time that's lost when time is measured, when movement is measured, when it's expressed in equations, etc. So this time not contaminated by space, durée, what what is it? To explain it, Bergson often resorts to images or metaphors. One that I quite like is his, he uses the image of a melody. Again, it's kind of going to say what durée is not, but then it kind of points you towards what it is. So music can be transcribed into a succession of symbols. It can be symbolized in a lot of sort of physical ways. Each symbol represents a pitch, a tempo, a chord, etc. And this is useful for recording and sharing music, but it has little to do with how the music exists and is experienced. On a sheet of paper, a note can be erased or moved around, but when we listen to music, we don't hear a succession of separate units. There's a melding, there's an organic whole, which is the melody. We hear a swelling, a unity, a harmony. And if a single note were to be displaced, or if we interchange two notes, or if the melody stops before it's supposed to, our whole experience of the music would be changed, and it wouldn't be the same melody. And basically the same goes for our inner life. But we use words to tidy up the sort of overwhelming diversity and also the overwhelming fluctuant nature of all things. Basically, that's what he's getting at. I'm trying to think of other images that he uses, because I'm trying to do what in a much less virtuosic way. What he does is he throws a lot of these images at you, and they're meant to sort of all put together. They're meant to point you in the direction that you're looking for, because in Creative Evolution, he kind of does a quick summary in the beginning of the first chapter. He kind of goes over everything he's been up till then. So he goes over durée and then memory to be able to get to evolution. And I think in that passage, he just very helpfully says that when I look inside myself, as in an effort of introspection, what you're really going to find is a continuous change. So you go from one state to the next. But actually, even that kind of language tricks us into thinking of separate moments. So I with a clear cut before and after. So I was hungry, but then I ate. Then I was no longer hungry. I used to be a child. Now I'm an adult. But what's really happening there is that it's never as clear cut. We only add on top of the change spatial realities. The changes that happen within our consciousness, they're not merely transitions between otherwise stable states. They are change itself. That was me attempting to make sense of it.
It makes sense. It makes sense. From that, allow me to throw in something very abstract, because it intrigued me from your biography. It seems from this indefinable way to get out of standard quantification, and also quite humorously away from Spencer, who is almost like the antithesis of anything like that. It seems that Bergson is after some sort of absolute freedom, that at no point can there be space, pun intended, for anything that will segment or place or coordinate or anything like that. And from that seems to arise some form of freedom. And that comes to mind because you mentioned that he moves from the mechanistic from Spencer, which is extremely deterministic and locked in and no choice. But Bergson seems to want freedom, and is very optimistic.
He definitely completely rejects any form of determinism. Because what determinism does is that it actually maps out everything. It kind of claims that everything is already written, in a sense, because if you were like Laplace's demon, if you were able to know the coordinates of every single particle at one given time, you would then be able to predict, or you would be able to map out their future positions. So there's no room for novelty or creativity in a worldview like that. And so for Bergson, so in his doctoral thesis, which was translated as Time and Free Will, in the third chapter he tackles the question of free will in relation to determinism, and also in relation to other theories of freedom, really. His is quite radical, but against those who are claiming that this deterministic picture could also be applied to mental states. He responds that he's an anti-reductionist. That no matter how hard at the time psychophysicists, they were called, those who were trying to apply the laws of physics to experimental psychology, essentially. Bergson believed against them that the spontaneity of voluntary actions can't be boiled down to the predictable effects of clearly defined causes, because prediction relies on repetition and a projection forward. And in consciousness, there are simply never two moments are never repeated. There's never twice the same cause in consciousness. Even in situations where it might feel like you're living the same moment, if you're looking at the same painting 2 minutes after looking at it the first time, it's a completely different experience by virtue of the fact that you've already seen it and that you've accumulated the experience in between the first and second viewing. So there's, but the freedom that Bergson describes is particular in the sense that he sees it as there are degrees of freedom, because most of the time, and this actually gives ammunition to those who want to argue that we are acting following a predetermined, or at least a mechanistic or a physicalist sort of plan. We appear to be acting in that way because a lot of the time we are following rigid habits. We are, and it's for our survival mostly that we have these sort of quite deeply ingrained, but still quite surface level habits that we have that also manifest in sort of our social interactions and habits and values. And there's something quite automatic about all that, but beneath that surface level, there is the possibility for true free acts, which are a kind of perfect coordination between the person and their actions. It's when sort of everything, it's sort of the culmination of the particular duration of that person, culminating in an act of creation, because true freedom is actually creativity. It's putting forth something absolutely new. And that's quite rare. It's quite rare that we are able to sort of get beneath that layer of social and biological and all of these habits. But it's there in principle and it's there in action as well.
There seems to be a lot of joy in that. You seem to have found a lot of joy in it.
I think it's quite beautiful. It's quite a beautiful idea, and he has a great way of what he tends to do in most of his books actually is he's not only saying deterministic thinking is wrong, he's also saying other theories of freedom are wrong as well, because they're actually just determinism in disguise. And he does this in other books with other sort of these dualities that are throughout the history of thought. He's able to, between idealism and realism, even among the evolutionary theories. And I also get quite a lot of joy out of that, because I think that always makes him seem really interesting and new as well, is that his views are always somewhat unexpected, and I think still today they offer, especially in a world where, the Anglophone world, where a lot of analytic philosophy is kind of willfully ignorant about
everything.
Some of the continental side of things. I think there's a lot of room for reappropriating a lot of these ideas. And some people have been doing it. A friend of mine called Matthias Moravec has just written a sort of analytic philosophy of religion, a Bergsonian take on analytic philosophy of religion. And he does a really good job of making Bergson palatable, I think, to the average analytic reader, which is not an easy job. But I got a bit off track there. But
so I mean, we've sort of, to draw these two, I guess, threads together for at the later period, because we've spoken about, you've given instances of a few very clear points why Bergson dropped off so sharply. And there has been, I think, kind of Deleuze, of course, would you say that's the first sort of revival of Bergson, or was there? Am I right in thinking there was a smaller one before, and then now we're almost in one again? But none of them have. I don't know.
I'm just getting distracted because I'm thinking about the recent work that's being done in sort of there's this project called the Global Bergsonism Project, which is basically uncovering a lot of ways in which Bergson was, it turns out, really important for a whole school of Japanese thinkers, which obviously people who know about that knew all along, but it's kind of being translated, and so there were all these kind of receptions, and it was kind of happening all the time throughout the 20th century, it seems. So this particular instance, it's like the 20s and 30s, and then there's a South American reception. There's all sorts of things, but I think Deleuze was a big one, definitely. And he put him back on the map, definitely.
But there was no sort of Bergsonian school or direct discipled continuation.
That's right. It's a bit of a weird thing, but it also probably contributes to explaining why he sort of disappeared a bit, at least in the Anglophone world, definitely. But even though he had hundreds, even thousands of followers, there wasn't really anything like a Bergsonian school. As I mentioned before, perhaps one reason is because the Collège de France, because it is a open institution of learning, it also means that there aren't really any students. It's people who are coming in. It's the general public. There's no enrollment. There's no PhD student. There's no doctoral students that would have then sort of continued Bergson's legacy throughout their work. So that's one reason. But there's also, in a sense, there's no real applicable system of Bergsonism. Bergson was, there's no sort of easily identifiable, I would say, principles or postulates that you can then take and apply. Or you could try, but Bergson wouldn't have agreed with that. One of the defining features of his philosophy, paradoxically, is that there was no system to his philosophy. He said himself, and I have a quote here, I have no simple set of rules from which I could evolve my philosophy. In philosophy, there are different problems, and each problem must be solved by special methods. The methods employed in solving one problem will not do when you attempt to solve another problem. I cannot always deduce from answers I've already given the answers to other problems. there must be a new answer to every new question. So even though he always fell back on this idea of durée, according to him at least, there's no set of principles from which he derived his following theories. I think that there's at least some truth to that. There's a fluidity to his writing and to his ideas that meant that there was such a wide range when he was at his most famous. It's kind of mind-boggling the way in which he was both adored by, let's say, the Cubists and the modernist Catholics and the revolutionary syndicalists and the I don't know. There are so many examples of completely incompatible movements, at least, or schools of thought, that maybe says something about his philosophy in itself, or maybe it just says something about his reception and the way that he was caricatured. I don't know. But there seems to be something about his philosophy that allows people to take what they want from it and leave aside the rest in a way that you wouldn't get with Marxism or Freudianism or Darwinism. So, yeah.
Do you feel Bergson has truly had his day?
I think in a way that he might not have liked, that there are actually applications of his ideas, or maybe applications isn't the word, but there are ways of drawing inspiration from him. He actually thought that philosophy should be much more collaborative than it was at his time, or than it even is still now, and that he didn't think that people should be applying the theories of others. He thought that they should be collaborating in a way that he had this quite difficult to understand idea of metaphysics as kind of a progressive, cumulative science, almost something that could progress, and that was only possible if there was this kind of collaboration. So I think perhaps there are ways of furthering that project. I don't know. I definitely think that a lot of what he says about thinking of organisms in terms of temporality and process, that's definitely something that, with or without him, is having a big revival now. Process philosophy and process biology are definitely a thing. And I think there are many other places where his ideas could resonate and should. So but I don't know what he would say about it. That's a different question.
Okay. What do you think he would say about your biography?
That's a sad one, because I'm not sure he'd be very happy about it.
No?
I'm actually pretty sure he wouldn't, because he asked in his will, he asked his wife at least to destroy all of his papers, so all of his correspondence, all of his notes for potential future works. He wanted to maintain control as much as possible on what would be said about him and his life. And in a few places, he quite explicitly says there is nothing to be learned about a philosopher's philosophy by studying his life. And he clearly was uncomfortable, made uncomfortable by the fact that people were so interested in his life. So I think, sadly, he would be quite uncomfortable, even though I've done my best to be fair and to present him in a light that is not. I'm not trying to idolize him. I'm trying to present him as close as possible to what he was, I think, but as a person and as a complicated person. But I think he would probably see that as a bit voyeuristic. So sorry, Henri.
Is there anything you'd like to add about Bergson's biography, or anything specific from your book that you feel, I guess, possibly feel is key as well to clear up any misconceptions that we might not have broached, or anything you'd like to add in?
I think the main misconceptions are the ones that we've already mentioned, and they have a lot to do with culture wars almost between what counts as knowledge and what doesn't. And the main takeaway is that Bergson was neither anti-science nor bad at science. I think things that I found really fascinating about him were the stories that kind of the way in which this person who was so devoted to philosophy, really, and devoted to a quiet life as much as possible, and who often regretted moving to Paris when his first jobs were in the provincial towns. He often thought back to that time and thought, well, I wouldn't have had as much reach, but maybe I would have had a better life, kind of thing. And yet this man had such an incredible life in terms of not only the fame, but then also something we haven't mentioned, which is that during World War I, he was sent on a secret mission to America to meet the US President, Wilson. So the French government basically sent him thinking... So the goal was to convince the US to join the war in 1917 at a critical time of the war. Mm-hmm. And Wilson had been re-elected on a platform of he kept us out of the war. So he needed his mind changed. And the French government thought that sending a diplomat would be too obvious and would backfire. And instead they decided to send Bergson, who was quite reluctant at first, but then...
What was their reasoning for him specifically, just because he was so well known?
Because he was very well known, and because Wilson was a bit of a philosopher. Okay. He'd been the president of a university, a prestigious university before, and he was possibly they thought he would be. They had a better chance of swaying him with someone like Bergson, who was a world-renowned philosopher who had a few years before that had a triumphant trip to America, where he delivered lots of conferences and established a strong relationship with a lot of American academics. So they decided to send Bergson, and at a time when there was blown out submarine warfare. So every time Bergson crossed the Atlantic, he was putting his life at risk like everyone else. And he played a really clever game. He befriended Wilson's closest advisors, and he used flattery, and he eventually managed to meet with Wilson himself. And we don't know what they said. There's no notes from those meetings, but we do know that Wilson eventually did decide to join the war. The reasons that are given usually are, on the one hand, that this submarine warfare that actually impacted US citizens, and also there was an intercepted telegram, I think, showing that Germany were trying to rally Mexico to their cause, or something that worried the Americans. But there's also this side to the story that's not often told. Bergson was very modest about the whole thing, saying, I don't think I had anything to do with it. But some of Wilson's advisors, who he remained friendly with, disagreed and thought he did have a great deal to do with it, or that they shared the same vision of a United Nations as well, and this was something that Bergson would have been able to tell Wilson that the only way for the USA to have a seat at the table in those negotiations was to join the war. So I think that comes as a surprise to people when they hear that story for the first time, because it's such a huge thing.
It's a testament to the culture of the day as well. I mean, mm-hmm. I can't imagine today that we'd send, who's our most famous philosopher today? Would probably be Zizek, to mention him again, send him to meet. It's not going to happen.
No. Definitely not. No, it is a different world for sure. But yeah, that's something I was fascinated to learn more about as I was working on this book, and to sort of learn about how the resolve that sort of so Bergson, obviously, it was the dangerous part was crossing the Atlantic, which was quite significant danger. But then his ability to charm people over there and get in their good graces, and then the fact that after it had happened for years, he didn't want the story to be made public because he didn't want the people he had befriended to feel betrayed. He didn't want because obviously he didn't want to gloat about it, and he didn't want it to be made obvious that that was the only reason he was there, and that was what his mission was, and that was what he was doing. He didn't want them to feel like they'd been used, even though they kind of were. It sounds like, but it's quite amazing, and it kind of, so that was 1917. Then there was the debate with Einstein, and then quite soon after that, Bergson's health completely deteriorated, and he basically never recovered and basically removed himself from all public life. But you can sort of see how that would happen with such an intense period between sort of decade, essentially, where he had, according to him, almost no days off, if even that, even a half day off.
Yeah. He lived he lived to 82 though, right?
Yeah.
So it was a long life.
Long life, but with a lot of pain in the final 2 decades. He had sort of really severe rheumatoid arthritis, which would lots of joint swelling and fever and exhaustion, inability to really work. So it took him almost 3 decades to write his final book. But it's he kind of paid the price for the madness of the 1910s and early 20s, basically.
Did he see himself sort of as a success at the end? I don't mean in terms of celebrity, but in terms of the work that he had put out and published. Do you think he felt that he had, I guess, just done his best?
I think so. I think he was anxious to get his final book, well, not his final book, but his final sort of monograph, because he published The Two Sources of Morality and Religion in 1932, and after that there was another sort of compilation of talks and articles that came out 2 years later. But for The Two Sources, because he was finding it so hard to work, and he was only able to work a few hours, if that, every day on it. He was worried about not saying things right, and that came out almost a decade before he died, because it came out in 1932. But so I think he was slightly. That's really what mattered to him the most, was getting the philosophy right, and by the end, so in the final decade of his life, he would tell his friends that he was working on ideas, but ideas that were not intended for publication, that were kind of for him, and that were for, I guess, him to get ready for the next step, which was death. And at that time, he was undergoing a kind of conversion to Catholicism, which wasn't official, never officialized, but he became obsessed. Around the time he started working on The Two Sources, he became obsessed with Christian mystics, and so that's another interesting aspect of his life, actually, that he had this conversion to Catholicism that wasn't institutional or had little to do with doctrine, but was a very personal choice that he didn't want made public, or not too public, because especially in the very end, he didn't want it to be seen as a endorsement of the increasingly violent anti-Semitism that culminated in World War II. So that also says something about his character, I think.
Okay. Where would you advise people to begin with Bergson?
I often tell people, and this is often when it's people who haven't studied philosophy or who have never read anything like Bergson, at least. I often say that they should start with a fairly short text, which is an introduction to metaphysics, which is an article he published in 1903, and it has an English translation that's fairly good. And it's where he introduces his idea of intuition. Or, well, he doesn't introduce it there, but it's where he contrasts it with what he calls analysis. And I think it's a kind of the closest we'll get to a kind of methodology. I don't think that's a good description of it, but it's as close as we'll get to Bergson laying out this is how I do things, or this is how I think of things when I do philosophy. I think that's quite a good start because it gives you a sense of what's going on here. It gives you a sense of his language, and it's short enough that it's not too overwhelming, because the thing with his main books is that they're very steeped in the scientific debates of the time. So, for instance, Creative Evolution, the whole first chapter goes into great detail about 4 competing evolutionary theories in the early 20th century, and the only one the current modern day reader will have heard of is Darwinism, and it's a special version of Darwinism because of how Darwinism evolved itself over time. But that can be a bit disconcerting, I think, or not disconcerting, but a bit confusing maybe if you're... I still would recommend reading Creative Evolution, and there's a very good new translation that came out a year or two ago by Donald Land. But you have to be kind of aware of that context. And then in most of his books, he gets to the main point in the middle. There's always kind of a chapter before and after the main point. So in Time and Free Will, it was the second chapter that dealt with Durer more directly, and when he had his doctoral defense, he was really upset because his examiners only wanted to talk about the first and third chapters, which they found fascinating, whereas he thought that those were kind of a prelude and a kind of way of wrapping up what was most important, which was the center of the book. And that happens a lot, I think. With Creative Evolution, some people have read it as this kind of manifesto for vitalism and the élan vital, which appears in the first chapter. But actually, the main stuff is happening in chapters 2 and 3, where he gets into the biological origins of the human intellect and the very possibility of intuition and those things. So I'm not really answering your question. I'm just it's kind of a warning. It's same with Matter and Memory, very huge amount of detail about debates about aphasia in the 19th century that might be off-putting, but then there's so much around that. So I would advise starting with something like Introduction to Metaphysics, and then maybe reading one of his other works with a companion to it, something like Marx and Claire's Bergson, that is a very good introduction, or Suzanne Gerlach's, I think it's called Thinking in Time, which is a really good introduction to his first 2 books, to Time and Free Will and Matter and Memory.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. What are you working on now? Or are you taking a break?
I'm actually I am taking a break a bit. I'm going to have to promote this book a little bit, and I might be taking a break from. I might be taking leave from philosophy for a bit. Yeah. I have some other ideas, but they have nothing to do with philosophy, so we'll have to see. But yeah, I think I've earned to give my brain a bit of a rest. from all this thinking, thinking about Bergson.
Well, I'll be sure to put the links for this book, Herald of a Restless World, How Henri Bergson Brought Philosophy to the People, in the description below. And again, for the US, that's October 22nd, and for the UK, it's October 24th. And those links will be down below, as well as the link for your own website. But yeah, it's been a great conversation. Emily Herring, thanks very much.
Thank you so much for having me.